Okay, so by now you probably would have been exposed to the principles and conduct for a logical debate, and those 12 principles will have been taught to you to explain what's expected of someone taking part in a logical debate. All of these fallacies relate to the structural criterion. So the structural criterion is focused around the way you structure an argument and the way you set out your ideas. The structural criterion is based around the way you structure your ideas, your sentences, your phrases, your clauses, even right down to a sentence level. And whether you're doing that in a way that lends understanding to your audience or in a way that purposely obscures the points you're trying to. So within the structural criterion, there are 3 different subcategories that we'll be looking at. The first category are begging the question fallacies, which are around questions obviously, but also the way that you load the language that you are using. Second, fallacies of inconsistencies, which of course focus on inconsistencies within your logic and the way you're presenting it. And thirdly, fallacies of deductive inference, which are the more formal fallacies, therefore we won't go into much detail about them, and I'll just give you the names of them, and it's something you can explore in your own time if you like. Okay, so the first fallacy for the structural criterion is circular reasoning, also called arguing in a circle. So this is where one of your premises is also embedded within your argument. So for example, euthanasia allows a choice. Therefore, people should be allowed to choose their own end by making a choice. So the element of choice is repeated and it doesn't actually move beyond its first premise, which is that people should be able to choose. So it's basically an empty sentence that doesn't actually add to the argument, it just relies on its own self as evidence. Next up is loaded language, and this is very straightforward. It's where you load the language with connotation-rich words, so that it sounds as though the argument has already been solved. The example would be in perhaps a courtroom, if you were to say, "We have met here today to discuss the evil wrongdoings of this criminal mastermind." The audience already is led to believe what you believe, which is that the person on trial is a criminal mastermind. The third fallacy is a loaded question. For example, after you murdered him, what did you do afterwards on the 22nd of February? This is a fallacy because it requires the person or the respondent to do 2 things at once, which is firstly disprove the allegation within the question, but then also respond to the question as well, which is something that makes it purposely difficult for them to do. And it also requires a breach in manners in that they have to point out the fact that you actively tried to entrap them with your loaded question. 4 is question begging definition. For example, if love is something that can never end, then divorce shouldn't be necessary. And so this is probably not a great example to be honest, but this is what you're doing here is you're shifting or changing the definition of a key term of a debate and making it simpler or easier or more basic, and therefore it's more easy to exploit when you speak about it. 5 is incompatible premises. So a premise is a key foundation of an argument. So for example, an example of incompatible premises would be, I believe in science and magic, therefore the world should be full of scientific magicians. So the problem here is pretty obvious. The 2 premises that the argument relies on can't actually coexist or make sense together, and therefore the whole argument is fallacious. 6 is contradiction between premise and conclusion. For example, I believe we should all get along. Getting along is best achieved through military law, therefore we should enact curfews and military law. And as is obvious from this overblown example, the premise and the conclusion don't actually match, and this is quite confusing and also fallacious. These last 5 fallacies we won't be going into in any real detail because they're almost impossible to realize or notice in the real world. As you may have noticed from fallacy 5 and 6, they were heading more towards structural and rule-based breaches which made them fallacious. And these last 5 definitely meet that criteria as well. If you're interested in formal and structured logic, then you may want to look into these 5 other ones, but unless you're probably studying logic at a university level, these ones don't really relate to the type of language analysis we're looking at.